My phone was gone. The lock clicked, and Cliff said through the door, still laughing, "Maybe a night alone will fix your attitude, Walt." Then footsteps, then nothing. Just me, 64-degree air, and the hum of $2 million worth of servers. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent 4 years of my career learning exactly what to do when someone locks you in a room and walks away. My name is Walt Horan. I'm 57. I've been IT infrastructure lead at Hargrove Data Systems in Columbus, Ohio for 9 years. Before that, I spent 4 years doing penetration testing for a private security firm, finding holes in systems before the bad guys did. I never put that on my Hargrove application. Didn't seem relevant for an infrastructure role. That night, it became very relevant. Let me back up a little. Cliff Doyle had been VP of technology for 11 months. He was 47, sharp dresser, good at working a room. What he wasn't good at was the actual job. His network architecture knowledge was roughly a decade behind, and most of the senior team knew it. But Cliff had something more valuable than skills. He had the CEO's ear. Gerald Foss had brought him in personally, and that made Cliff feel untouchable. For 11 months, I watched him take my proposals, put his name on them, and walk them upstairs. The network migration plan I spent 6 weeks on. Cliff presented it to the board in October like it was his own work. Didn't change a word, didn't even say thank you privately. I let it go, twice. Then I started noticing something else. In the past 2 years, 3 other senior IT guys had quietly left the company, all of them over 50. All of them after friction with Cliff. I found out through Ned Pruitt, a networked admin who'd been around even longer than me, that Cliff had a private chat running with his son Brett, who worked at the company as product manager. In that chat, they called guys like us deadweight. One message from Cliff read, "Need to refresh the team. Too many dinosaurs slowing things down." Dinosaurs. That's what 20-plus years of hands-on experience looks like to a guy who got his job through a phone call. The night everything changed started at a client presentation. Cliff was walking the Harmon Group through a proposed infrastructure upgrade. Midway through, he made a technical claim that was flat out wrong. The kind of mistake that would have cost the client real money and circled back on us within 6 months. I spoke up, corrected it, right there in the room in front of the client team. Cliff's face didn't change, but his eyes did. That evening around 9/2, I was in the server room running a routine performance check. Cliff had been in there earlier, also running diagnostics on the main terminal. Brett called him out into the hallway in the middle of it. Cliff stepped out without logging off. A few minutes later, he came back with Brett behind him. He told me they needed the room for an emergency system review. Said to leave my badge and phone on the desk. Something felt off, but I handed them over. They walked out. The magnetic lock engaged. Through the door, Brett said something I won't repeat. Cliff just said, "One night in there should help you remember your place, Walt." Then their footsteps faded down the hallway. I stood there for about a minute. The room was cold. Server rooms run around 64 degrees to protect the equipment, and I was in a dress shirt and slacks. I thought about my options, waited out. Hope the cleaning crew showed up early, bang on the door, and give Cliff exactly the reaction he was looking for. Then I put my hand in my inside jacket pocket and felt the USB drive. Old habit from my pen testing days. I've carried an emergency kit for so long it's just part of getting dressed in the morning. Specialized diagnostic tools, custom access scripts, the kind of thing that comes in handy when you need to find out what's broken in a system quickly and quietly. I never thought about it at Hargrove, never had a reason to. I looked at the central terminal across the room, screen still on, Cliff's session still open. He'd walked out in the middle of a live diagnostic and hadn't logged off. I sat down at the terminal. First thing I did was log out of Cliff's session. Using his credentials would have made everything I found inadmissible and given him an easy way out later. I plugged in my USB, opened my own tools, and accessed the system through a security gap. My team had formally reported to management 3 times in the past year, each time in writing, each time with a timestamp. Nobody upstairs had acted on it. That was going to matter later. I started with the internal messaging system. It didn't take long to find the channel I was looking for. Tech leadership only, Cliff, Brett, and 2 other department managers. I scrolled back through months of conversations and read everything carefully. There were messages mocking senior employees by name. There was a full thread where Cliff told Brett to remove my name from the network migration proposal and replace it with his before the board presentation. There was a message from 3 weeks after I joined Hargrove that read, "Keep Walt on legacy maintenance rotation. He's useful but can't know how much we rely on him. Easier to control that way." I copied everything to a secure folder on my drive, then I went deeper. The Harmon Group project had some unusual numbers in the billing records. I pulled the invoice files and cross-referenced them against internal timesheets. 340 hours billed to the client. 160 hours actually worked. That left 180 hours of labor that existed on paper and nowhere else. At the enterprise rate Hargrove charged Harmon, that gap worked out to roughly $180,000. I sat back in the chair and just stared at that number for a moment. Then I followed the money. It took about 40 minutes to trace it through 3 internal transfers. Each one was structured to look like a routine vendor payment, but the destination account belonged to a company called Doyle Tech Consulting LLC. I pulled the business registration documents. Owner, Clifford Doyle. He wasn't just stealing credit for other people's work. He was stealing actual money from an actual client and routing it to his own pocket through a shell company. I kept going. Every invoice in that billing scheme had been reviewed and signed off by Brett Doyle, Cliff's 24-year-old son working in his product manager role with no business reason to be approving IT project invoices in the first place. His signature was on 7 of them over a 14-month window, and the HR layer. I found complaint files, 4 of them, submitted over the past 2 years by employees who had since left the company. All 4 had been routed through Sandra Doyle, HR director. All 4 were marked in the system as reviewed, no action required. None of them had been escalated. None of them had been flagged to the board or to outside compliance. Sandra was Cliff's wife. The whole thing was a family operation. Cliff ran the fraud. Brett signed the paperwork. Sandra buried the complaints. 3 people, same last name, systematically working a company from the inside. I copied everything to my drive and leaned back in the chair. Here's where I want to pause for a second, because if you're watching this and you have ever been the person in the room who gets passed over, talked over, or written off because someone decided you were past your prime, I want you to stay with me. What I did next was not luck. It was not revenge in the way most people think about revenge. It was 4 years of professional training applied to exactly the right situation at exactly the right moment. And it started with one decision. I was not going to hand this to HR. I was not going to send a quiet email to a manager. I was going to make sure that when this came out, there was no version of events where it could be minimized, delayed, or buried the way those 4 complaints had been buried. I opened a new window and started building. The idea was simple. Instead of waiting until morning and trying to present evidence in a meeting where Cliff would have home field advantage and a room full of people who owed him favors, I would take that option away entirely. I created a formatted audit report, organized by category, with every source document attached and time-stamped, clean, professional. The kind of thing that looks like it came from an outside firm, not from someone who had just spent 3 hours on a cold floor. Then I set it up as a scheduled email send for 6 a.m. recipients. Every board member, the 2 largest clients, including Harmon Group directly, and the corporate compliance address listed in the company bylaws. The report would go out whether I was still in this room or not, whether Cliff opened that door early or decided to leave me in here through the weekend. There was nothing he could do to stop it once the clock started. I set the send time and closed the window. Then I sat there for a minute thinking about whether the company email system had any outbound filters that might flag a large attachment send outside business hours. I had seen IT tickets about that filter before. It had been flagged twice in the past year for blocking legitimate client reports. I went back in and checked the outbound mail configuration. The filter was set to flag attachments over 25 megabytes going to external addresses. My report was 18 megabytes. I was inside the limit, but barely. I split the attachments into 2 sends, same recipients, 9 megabytes each, 1 minute apart, both well under the threshold. Then I set the sends and closed everything down. It was around 1:15 in the morning. I had been in the room for about 4 hours. I was cold and my back was stiff from sitting in a server room chair that was not built for long sessions. I got up and walked the length of the room a few times just to move. That is when I heard the door handle. I stepped back from the terminal and stood still. The handle moved again, slow and careful. Then the door opened about 6 inches and stopped. Walt? Low voice. Not Cliff, not Brett. I recognized it after a second. Ned Pruitt, 61 years old, network admin, one of the guys I mentioned who had been quietly edged toward the exit over the past couple of years. He was pulling a TDM shift that week, covering for a tech who had called out sick. He said he had walked past and noticed the server room light was on at an odd hour. He pushed the door and found it unlocked from the outside, which told him someone was in there who was not supposed to be. I told him what had happened. He stood in the doorway without saying anything for a long moment. Then he walked in and let the door close behind him. I've been sitting on files for almost 2 years, he said quietly. Kept telling myself I was too close to retirement to make waves. He pulled out his own drive. Backup files he had kept offline, deleted internal emails, a memo from Cliff describing his plan to phase out what he called legacy staff before the next fiscal year review. Exit interview notes from 2 of the guys who had left notes that HR had officially logged as no grievances filed despite the interviews telling a very different story. We went through everything together. By the time we were done, it was close to 3 in the morning and the picture was complete. Ned headed back upstairs around 3:15. Before he left, he said one thing that stuck with me. I kept quiet because I thought it would protect my pension, but they were going to push me out anyway. I just kept handing them time. He left. I heard his footsteps go down the hallway and then nothing again. I found a spot on the floor between 2 server racks, pulled my jacket tight, and sat with my back against the wall. The room hummed. The lights stayed on. I was not going to sleep, but I was not going to burn more energy either. I had done what I needed to do. The report was scheduled. The evidence was backed up in 3 places. All I had to do now was wait for 6 a.m. to come and go. I thought about the 3 guys who had left before me, guys who had put in real years at Hargrove, who knew those systems better than anyone, who had made the mistake of getting older in a department run by someone who saw experience as a liability. I thought about the 4 complaints sitting in Sandra's files marked no action required. I thought about the word dinosaurs and what it feels like to read that about yourself in a private message that was never meant for your eyes. It did not make me angry in the way you might expect. It made me focused. At 5 a.m., I got up, straightened my shirt, and stood near the terminal. I did not sit back down. I just stood there and waited. At 6:01, my scheduled sends went out, both of them. I had set up a blind confirmation receipt on my personal email routed through a browser session. 2 green checks appeared on the screen. 18 recipients on the first send, 18 on the second. Board members, clients, compliance. Everything delivered. At 6:22, the door opened. Cliff walked in first, Brett behind him. And behind Brett, a man I did not recognize in a jacket and tie who I later found out was internal legal counsel, brought in by Gerald Foss directly after he had already read the report on his phone during his morning drive-in. Cliff looked at me the way someone looks at a problem they think they have already solved. "Sleep well?" he said. "Actually, yes," I said. He smiled at that. Satisfied. He thought a night on a cold floor had done its job. "Good. Glad to hear it. Hope you used the time to think about how things work around here." "I did," I said. "You should check your email." Something shifted in his face. Not full alarm yet, just a small flicker of something he could not name. He pulled out his phone. Brett did the same about 2 seconds later. The legal counsel already had his out. Nobody said anything for about 8 seconds. Then Cliff's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked at me, answered it. I could not hear the other end, but I did not need to. I watched Cliff's face go from confused to pale to something that had no word for it in about 30 seconds. He said yes sir 3 times and ended the call. He stood there holding the phone at his side. "You had no right," he said. His voice was flat. The confidence was gone. "I had every right," I said. "You locked me in a restricted area overnight without food, water, or a phone. Every piece of evidence I found came through a security gap my team reported to management 3 times in writing. The access trail is clean and documented." Brett started to say something. The legal counsel put a hand on his arm and shook his head once. We took the elevator to the executive floor without speaking. The 4 of us stood in that elevator and nobody looked at anyone else. The conference room was already full when the doors opened. Gerald Foss sat at the head of the table. He was 61 and had built Hargrove from a 12-person shop into a regional firm with 200 employees. Right now, he looked like a man who had just found out that the house he built had been robbed from the inside. Board members lined one side of the table. 2 outside attorneys the company kept on retainer sat near the window. The IT director was at the far end with a laptop open. Nid was already there, sitting quietly near the wall, hands folded on the table. Gerald did not open with small talk. I spent the first hour of my morning reading a 47-page audit report that arrived in my inbox at 6:01 a.m., he said. Along with every board member, 2 of our largest clients, and our compliance office. He looked at Cliff. "I want to hear from Walt first." I laid it out in order. The 11 months of stolen proposals. The network migration plan presented as Cliff's work with my name removed. The systematic isolation of senior employees, all of them over 50, all pushed out within 18 months of pushback against Cliff. The Harmon Group billing record showing 340 hours invoiced against 160 hours worked. The $180,000 routed to Doyle Tech Consulting, LLC. Brett's signature on all 7 invoices. The 4 HR complaints filed and buried by Sandra, all marked no action required with no escalation to the board or outside compliance as required under company policy. I spoke for about 12 minutes. Nobody interrupted me. When I finished, Gerald turned to the IT director who had been pulling up security footage on his laptop. The hallway camera outside the server room showed Cliff and Brett walking me in at 9:08 p.m. and leaving at 9:10 p.m. without me. It showed the door locked from the outside. It showed Ned arriving at 1:14 a.m. and leaving at 3:02 a.m. It showed Cliff, Brett, and the council arriving at 6:02 a.m. Gerald watched the footage for a moment. Then he looked at Cliff. "Did you lock Walt in the server room?" Cliff said it was a misunderstanding, that I had agreed to stay and monitor a system issue overnight. Gerald looked at the screen, looked back at Cliff. His phone was found on the desk inside. The IT director said quietly, along with his badge. The room went very still. The outside auditor, who had been sitting quietly near the window, spoke next. He had been called in at 5:30 a.m. when the first board members started reading their emails and making phone calls. He walked through the Harmon Group billing records line by line, 340 hours invoiced, 160 hours documented in internal timesheets, 18 hours that existed on paper and nowhere else, $180,000 transferred in 3 stages to Doyle Tech Consulting LLC over 14 months. He put Brett's name on the screen next to each invoice date, 7 invoices, 7 signatures. A product manager approving IT contractor billing with no documented authority to do so and no record of anyone questioning it. Brett said he had not understood what he was signing, that he had trusted his father's direction. The auditor pulled up the email thread where Cliff had explicitly told Brett which invoices to approve, and when, sent from Cliff's personal email to Brett's personal email, not the company's system. Brett had printed them and kept them in a folder in his desk drawer. The folder had been retrieved that morning as part of the board's emergency review. Brett stopped talking. Cliff tried a different angle. He said the security vulnerabilities I had used to access the system made everything I found inadmissible. He used the word illegal twice. One of the outside attorneys looked up from her notepad. "Mr. Doyle, the vulnerabilities in question were flagged to your office in writing on 3 separate occasions over the past 14 months. Your office took no action. Under company IT policy and Ohio state statute, failure to remediate a known security gap after documented notification shifts liability for any resulting access to the party responsible for remediation. That party is you." Cliff looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. Gerald had been quiet through most of this. He was not a man who talked when he did not need to. He had built a company by listening more than speaking, and right now he was listening to everything fall apart around the person he had personally hired and personally vouched for. He looked at Brett, his son's colleague, a 24-year-old who had been handed a title and used it to sign fraudulent invoices for his father. Then he looked at Sandra's empty chair. She had been called to a separate meeting with HR compliance and outside counsel before the main session began. Gerald had made that call himself at 5:45 a.m. He turned back to the room and asked me directly, "What do you want to see happen here, Walt?" I had thought about that question during the night. I had a lot of time to think. 3 things, I said. First, everyone with direct involvement in the billing fraud and the complaint suppression is terminated today. Not suspended. Not put on administrative leave pending review. Terminated. Gerald nodded once. Second, every project contribution from the past 11 months gets re-audited by the IT director with documentation corrected to reflect actual authorship. That includes the network migration plan and everything tied to the Harmon account. The IT director made a note. Third, the IT department gets a new reporting structure, direct line to the board with an independent compliance channel that does not route through HR, written into policy, not just practice. The board chair, a woman named Patricia who had said very little up to that point, leaned forward slightly. "Those all seem reasonable. Is there anything else?" "Yes," I said. "I would like to lead the restructuring of the IT department, not Cliff's title, a new role. Clean mandate reporting directly to the board during the transition period." There was a pause. Gerald looked at the board chair. She looked at the other board members. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Cliff made one last attempt. He said I had manipulated the situation, that I had provoked him at the client meeting, deliberately to create a pretext for what I did in the server room. I looked at him across the table. "You locked a 57-year-old employee in a 64-degree room overnight without food, water, or a phone," I said. "You called experienced professionals dinosaurs in writing. You ran a billing fraud that stole $180,000 from a client, and you used your wife's HR position to bury every complaint filed against you for 2 years." I paused. "The security footage, the emails, the invoices, and the timesheets are all in the report that went to your 2 largest clients this morning. Whatever you think about how I found that information, the information is accurate and it is already out there." The room was quiet. Gerald turned to the legal counsel. A short conversation, mostly nods. Then he turned back. "Cliff, Brett, please step outside with counsel." They left. The door closed. Gerald looked at me. The board will need to vote on the structural changes in the new role. That will take a few days, but the terminations will be processed today. He paused. I owe you an apology, Walt, not just for last night, for 11 months of not paying closer attention. I did not say anything to that. There was not much to say. Ned was still sitting near the wall. He had not spoken during the meeting. Gerald looked over at him. Ned, I understand you have been sitting on some of this for a while, about 2 years, Ned said. Gerald nodded slowly. I would like you to stay through your retirement date, full benefits, no interruption, and I would like your input on the restructuring if you're willing to give it. Ned looked at me. I looked at him. I can do that, he said. The meeting broke up around 9:15 a.m. People filed out in small groups, talking quietly. The outside auditor stayed behind with the legal team. The IT director was already on his phone. I walked to the window and looked out at Columbus on a gray November morning, traffic on the street below, a coffee shop on the corner starting to fill up, normal day out there. Everything the same as it was yesterday. By noon, Cliff and Brett had been escorted out of the building by security. 2 boxes each. The walk across the lobby that Cliff had made hundreds of times, now for the last time. Sandra submitted her resignation from HR at 11:40 a.m., about 20 minutes before the compliance investigation was scheduled to formally begin. I heard about it secondhand. I was already back in my office by then, working through a backlog that had piled up while I spent the night on a server room floor. The Harmon Group situation was handled directly by Gerald and the board chair. They called the client that morning, disclosed the billing discrepancy in full, and committed to a complete refund of the $180,000 plus a fee adjustment on the current contract. It was not a comfortable call, but it was the right one, and Harmon stayed. I found out later that the client's operations director said he respected the fact that the company came to him before he had to come to them. The board vote on the restructuring took 3 days. The new role passed without opposition. IT infrastructure and security reporting directly to the board through a standing committee, with a compliance channel that operated independently of HR and required mandatory escalation for any complaint involving a department head or above. I spent the first 2 weeks in the new role doing nothing but listening. I met with every person on the IT team individually, asked them what was broken, what they had been afraid to say, and what they needed to do their jobs. I got a lot of answers people had been sitting on for a long time. One of the first things I did with the information was put together a workload audit. It confirmed what I already suspected. The senior guys who had left were not slow or resistant to change. They had been deliberately buried under legacy maintenance tickets, while junior staff with less context were put on the visible projects. It was a system designed to make experienced people look unproductive so that pushing them out looked like a performance decision instead of what it actually was. I reached out to 2 of the guys who had left. Both of them took the calls. Both came back within 6 weeks, 1 full-time and 1 on a contract basis. Neither of them made a big deal about it. They just showed up and got to work. That was the kind of people they were. The criminal referral on the billing fraud went to the Ohio Attorney General's office in the 3rd week. I was not involved in that process beyond providing documentation when asked. That was a matter for lawyers and investigators, and it moved on its own timeline. What I knew was that the paper trail was clean and complete, and there was not going to be a version of events where $180,000 in fraudulent invoices signed by a named individual over 14 months ended quietly. Ned retired 4 months later on the date he had originally planned. We had a small thing for him in the break room, nothing elaborate. He said a few words, mostly about the people he had worked with, and then he went home to start the next part of his life. He deserved every bit of it. I took one more walk through the server room about a month into the new role. Same room, same hum, same cold air. I stood there for a couple of minutes and thought about what Cliff had been trying to do when he turned that lock. He thought he was putting me in a box, reminding me of my place, giving me a night to think about the gap between where I was and where he was, and decide it was not worth fighting. He did not understand that the gap he saw as his advantage was the same gap that gave me 9 uninterrupted hours, a logged-in terminal, and every tool I needed. He handed me the room and walked away laughing. That is the thing about underestimating someone with 30 years of experience. You assume the years slowed them down. You do not consider that the years taught them exactly how to wait, exactly what to look for, and exactly when to move. They thought the dark was a punishment. I had been working in the dark my whole career. I just never needed them to know that until the night they locked the door. If you have ever been the most experienced person in the room and still felt invisible, this one is for you. If you have watched younger people with less knowledge and more connections take credit for your work and move up while you stayed put, you already know exactly what Walt felt sitting on that floor. Here's what I want you to take from this. Your experience is not a liability. It is not something to apologize for or downplay or hide. Every year you have put in, Every system you have learned, every problem you have solved quietly without needing anyone to applaud it, that is real, that is yours. And the right situation will make it count in ways the people who dismissed you never anticipated. If this story hit close to home, drop a comment below and tell me about it. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. There's more where this came from.